But I would actually love to know more right now, right away, about the ventilator situation and exactly your team's role in aiding in the
So this is a very, very rapidly evolving, changing situation. When we started, and this was about a month ago, the anticipated projections were that we would completely outstrip any capacity to ventilate patients. And very early on, and building on the experience in China and in Italy and elsewhere, it was clear that a large number of the people who get intubated do relatively well if you can support them. And so there's a period of time after which they are ventilator dependent, but that if you supported them, they do come off and they do recover. So it was not a hopeless kind of a thing as people were going downhill, which it might have been, but it turned out not to be, and we were aware of that early on. So it became doubly important to have capacity to help people when that was necessary. We thought we were going to be overwhelmed with 3 or 4 times the number of available ventilators. An extraordinary effort was made to mobilize bringing in ventilators, bringing them out of stockpiles in various places, redistributing them to the places, and that has contributed significantly to increase our capacity. The other thing is we got extraordinarily lucky in that the surge was not as bad in that capacity as we'd expected. And right now we're looking at a pretty close match of what's come in and our ability to ventilate with conventional ventilation. Clearly, all the things I'm going to talk about next are not the standard of care we're used to, but are fixes and attempts to deal with this overwhelming need that was perceived. May not be necessary for us in some hospitals, but is unquestionably going to be important in rural centers and other countries that have less resources than we do. And perhaps as the wave of peaks sort of coronavirus infection happens across the United States in different places, we will see surges mimicking what happened in New York. And hopefully we have now peaked and are starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel. We're by no means out of the woods, but we think we've stopped seeing an increase. And so if that's true, then New York will manage to get through this without the ventilators being a major limiting factor, but other places will see this. So what we got involved in very early on was, what do you do if you don't have a ventilator? And reason that I'm connected with this is that in the sleep world, we have these devices for treatment of sleep apnea, which are functionally very close to ventilators. So it's important to distinguish between the usual treatment for sleep apnea, which is CPAP, which is not a ventilator. That is perhaps useful for delivering PEEP and things that are useful, but it's not able to actually move gas in and out the way a ventilator does. However, a variation of CPAP is bi-level, or sometimes called BiPAP, which is a trade name of one of the companies. But bi-level is essentially a ventilator, and we call it non-invasive ventilation, and in a small group of people that is used by mask. The reason you can't just take it and connect it from the mask to an endotracheal tube, which would theoretically work, is not anything about the machine. The machine actually works quite well at doing that within limitations. It can't generate extreme pressures. It has to have humidity added. The use of oxygen is a little bit different, but with very small modifications, it could do that. The problem is that the circuitry is such for these machines, and the way they've been optimized for a mask is use a large excess volume out into the air through a leak that's deliberate. And along with that, a lot of coronavirus gets sprayed all over the place. With a mask, there's not much you can do about that. But if you take the holes in the mask that are part of the circuit and move them out, you can put them in a position where you can now attach a filter to them and spare the healthcare worker the risk, the added risk that is perceived. Again, that risk has not been well quantitated, but it's certainly potentially there, and many recommendations have been against using the non-invasive versions of this, going to intubation, so as to capture that. So part of what we did was just looking at what the available circuits are, what the available machines are, what settings had to be done, how we could mate all the pieces into a system, and most important, how we could distribute materials and sort of a package for people who had to do this, who had relatively little experience in the intensive care unit. I think most great intensive care centers would be able to do this in about 15 minutes, put it all together, and fix the missing parts, because the supply chain is, of course, disrupted and these parts are not readily available. So part of what we did is to come up with kludges and fixes and 3D printed alternates to the parts that we couldn't get. But that actually turns out to be a relatively manageable task. The real challenge in my mind, and what we are now sort of trying to finish up on, is putting in one place a manual, how to do this if you haven't done it before, what pieces to order, what pieces you can't get, and how to substitute for them, and how to actually work your way through the screens of the devices that are out there to set it up right. And we've tried to put that all together in a series of very simple how-tos and manuals and things like that. Put it all on a website. We're trying now to link it all together so it's all one kind of a wiki document that you can work through. So if you have part A by manufacturer A and part B by manufacturer C, how do you make them together? What piece might be missing? How you can get that printed up with a file that can be used on your 3D printer. That kind of sort of field work is, I think, where we will have the most impact. Originally, we thought we were going to have to put this together, and I have to give credit. Elon Musk and Tesla donated initially several hundred of these blowers that are critical bi-level machines. Other people have added to that. So we had a very large number of the blowers in hand. We had a moderate number of bits and pieces for the circuitry. We had to make modifications. That all came together, and we're now able to do this. But as I said, the main issue now is that we don't actually need them ourselves in the numbers that we have, and other people will or do need them right now. And there are two levels of that. The first level being other hospitals within New York and ultimately elsewhere in the United States. And then beyond that, because we're trying to think ahead to where we're going to be in a couple of weeks, there are a series of countries with much inferior resources to what we have and less to count on, places like Africa, the Caribbean, the Pacific Islands that we talked about earlier, India, where rural health care is really, really much more basic. And my sense is that in those places, which sometimes have a very small number of ventilators, they won't be able to ship to their big centers of referral because they'll be overwhelmed at the same time. These places need something simple that will be applicable to their overwhelming burden when it strikes. And our hope, and we're working with some partners at the Population Health Department at NYU who have connections in Africa and elsewhere, where they're working with local health departments to try and get all of the things we learn and put together and do so that they could be helped through their difficult times, either with actual equipment or with instructions how to use stuff they've already got. And that to me is the next phase after our current one. Not to minimize what's already been a huge burden for New York City itself.
And Doc, I mean, first off, it's remarkable that you guys are able to put this together. And on top of that, it's almost funny how it fits into the shades of any kind of clinical innovation, and the fact that you guys are also putting together a guidance for it. You know, we see this all the time. It's not mainstream use until there's a guidance that's been decided upon by peers and is applicable to every facet of possible use of care. So that's all remarkable to hear, especially at a time when like this is absolutely necessary to have happened. I'm just curious regarding the resources relative to ventilators. What are a lot of these available? Is this much more easily manufactured, or?
It's both. So one thing is cost. So if they were readily available, a ventilator costs upwards of $30,000, $50,000 not infrequently because of all the fancy gadgets that are attached to it and the regulatory requirements. One of these bi-level machines typically will cost a couple of thousand, maybe 3,000. So just there you have a huge difference in resourcing. The second part of it is that Uh, there are a fair number of these out in the community and in home care companies and so on, because these therapies, bi-level therapy, has become quite widely used. So there's a lot of them out there. The manufacturers, while they probably can't double and triple their capacity for producing them, are ramping up. And a couple of months down the line, they'll be able to increase the supply. But there's already a lot of them out there and available. The trick is repurposing them, because they're intended for home use without monitoring, without alarms, without outputs, and with a mask. And so you have to sort of modify all those things, make up for the gaps, find out where to use them. So an example, in the beginning, we were thinking in terms of what do we do in the emergency room when there's two patients who are dying in front of you and you only have one ventilator? And can we use this as a Hail Mary kind of a situation? Very quickly, we realized that's probably not only not what was necessary, but not the best way to do this. And so now we've focused, at least in our setting, at making this a more of a step down kind of a device. So because we've shown in a very limited number of people, and by the way, I have to say the experience I'm describing is not just us. There are several other centers that are doing very similar kind of attempts at this. I think even in China and in Europe, they did a lot of this sort of very similarly to what we're doing. They just kind of perhaps did it a little bit more, just grabbing it off the shelf and doing it for themselves at the time, but they've shared their experience. There are several groups in the United States. I can think of at least two that we've interacted with, one in Long Island, Northwell Health, one in Berkeley, which has published that, several other groups that have published circuit diagrams and ideas very, very much similar. So it's not that we're the only ones doing it. It's just that there's a tremendous outwelling of effort and creativity that I think many people have done. Which, by the way, brings me to the next thing, which is I am absolutely blown away by the collaboration that's happened. Everybody's reaching out to everybody. As soon as you put something up in whatever means you put it up, people start saying, oh, can I contribute? Some of the people are outside the medical field. We've had some extraordinary donations of time, effort, and connections by somebody who reached out to us and who had some ideas for how he was going to generate ventilator production. We redirected that into saying, look, that's not our major need. What we need is help with getting this alternate to ventilation set up. He hooked us up with a 3D printing company that got us involved with printing up the parts we didn't have. The city of New York, the health department, and he have connected about trying to get bigger supply. There's a lot of this going on, and the speed with which this is going on is absolutely staggering. We've accomplished, and I don't mean we, but the medical field has accomplished in days what would have normally taken, months to years to accomplish in terms of developing a whole approach. And what we're doing now is we're setting up, for example, these devices so that when a patient is stabilized on a conventional ICU and respirator, as they begin to get a little more stable and it looks like they're going to be on a ventilator for a week, they could be shifted to this with appropriate sort of environments and free that ventilator up for the front lines where a more sick and unstable patient needing more
monitoring. So we have a priority set in terms of.
That's how we're doing it. Now, there are other places perhaps that will need them in the front line, and that certainly is part of the thinking. But the needs have evolved, and our appreciation of the best way to use this and putting the people who you give this, I kind of think of it as you've got a race course in front of you. You got a Grand Prix car and you got a Volkswagen, and you got to decide when the Volkswagen is going to go fast enough to get you to the finish line, as opposed to the Grand Prix car, which you don't have very many of.
Yeah.
And so, it's a team sport. And we want to use all the resources in the best possible way to give the maximum benefit to the patients and to the system, which is close to overwhelming.